there are people who do not just live one life, but are forced to carry two lives at the same time. And Sadio Mané is one of them. For nearly 2 decades, he steps onto the field with a calm smile, with that familiar running style that makes tens of thousands of people erupt in joy. But deep inside, there is always a silent pressure that no one really sees. It is not just the pressure to perform well, but the burden of the past, of family, of an entire hometown watching his every step. He has no privilege to fail, no right to live selfishly, and no chance to just be himself. Because every time he steps onto the field, he is not just a player, but also the hope, the responsibility, the answer for so many other lives. There are nights after the match, when the crowd has left and the lights gradually dim. He still has to face a very personal truth. Even though he has come so far, a part of him is still trapped where he began, where everything was lacking, where he cannot turn his back, and that forces him to live two parallel lives, one life admired by the whole world, and one quiet life where he continues to carry things no one sees, no one asks about, and no one truly understands completely. On the field, Sadio Mané has achieved feats that very few players can touch. He was an indispensable part of Liverpool's journey to the top with the UEFA Champions League title in 2019, followed by the Premier League title in 2019-2020 that ended the club's decades-long drought. He and his teammates also won the FIFA Club World Cup and the UEFA Super Cup. He once shared the Premier League Golden Boot in the 2018-2019 season, appeared multiple times in the Team of the Season for the league and for FIFA, and was honored as African Player of the Year in 2019 and 2022. In the Senegal national team jersey, he became a symbol when he contributed greatly to helping the team win the AFCON 2021 title, scoring the decisive penalty in the final. It not only brought the first title in the country's history, but also engraved his name into a legacy far beyond football, a journey that from the days when no one believed in him, he rose to the top of the world, yet still carried everything he has never left behind. Before continuing with the story, please hit like and leave a small gesture to acknowledge a person who has quietly carried the whole world on his shoulders without ever complaining. And if you want to understand more deeply about the life behind that spotlight, do not forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the journey that not everyone is strong enough to go all the way to the end. In a place very far from the brightly lit stadiums the world has ever seen, Sadio Mané's childhood did not begin with big dreams, but with a lack that lasted so long it became normal. Bambali was not a place where people talked about opportunities, but a place where people learned to accept, where simple roofs stood under the harsh sun, where meals were not always full, and where children grew up faster than their age because life did not allow them to slow down. In that cramped house, Mané was one of many children who had to share everything, from living space and food to even the smallest hopes for the future. There were no toys, no carefree afternoons, no dreams nurtured in the true sense. Only silence and eyes that understood too soon for their age, because there, everyone knew that if they were not strong, they would not survive. His father, a respected imam in the community, was not only the pillar of the family but also a rare spiritual support. But illness gradually took away his strength. The disease made his breathing heavy, making each passing day like a silent struggle that no one could help with. And in the moments when a child should have been protected, Mané had to witness the weakening of the father he believed could not fall, until the day no one wanted to mention arrived. His father passed away when Mané was still too young to fully understand what death was, but old enough to feel a void that could not be filled, a heavy silence spreading throughout the house, where, from then on, no one could replace that position. The large family became a real burden, not only for the mother but also for the children. Everything became scarcer, every responsibility fell on shoulders that were still too small. There was no choice but to grow up early, No one said it out loud, but everyone understood that from now on, life would not get easier. It could only get harder, and in that situation, tears were no longer something that appeared easily, because pain was not allowed to interrupt survival. Mane learned to stay silent, learned to endure, learned to keep going without anyone seeing how tired he was. The days passed with a monotonous rhythm, waking up with worries, going to sleep with thoughts that were never spoken. There was no space for weakness, no time for complaining, only responsibility. And in that repetition, childhood gradually disappeared without anyone noticing. It did not end with a specific moment, but faded slowly, replaced by obligations that a child should not have to bear, yet could not avoid. Amid all of that, football appeared as the only thing that brought a different feeling, not because it promised a clear future, but because it gave him a small space to breathe. On empty patches of land, with a simple ball or anything that could roll, Mané ran, not to become someone, but just to be himself for a few short minutes. Every time he touched the ball was a time he left reality behind. Every run was a way to forget what was waiting behind him. And in those moments, he was no longer the child of a poor family, no longer the one facing loss, no longer the one who had to grow up before his time. He was just a child playing, something simple but so rare that it became precious. But even when the ball rolled, reality still existed, and Mane understood that he could not escape forever. What he went through was not just hardship, but a process of formation, where pain was not explained, where silence became the common language, where everything had to continue even though no one knew how to continue. And it was in that environment that he gradually became a different person, not because he wanted to, but because he was forced to. A child learned to stand firm without anyone holding his hand, learned to keep going without anyone leading the way, and carried with him an endurance that later, when the whole world saw him shine, no one truly understood where it started and how it grew. Those afternoons on that barren land were not only the only place that made him feel relieved, but also the place where an invisible distance began between him and everyone around him. Because while other children played ball just to kill time, Sadio Mané looked at the ball as the only way to escape the life he was born into. A thought that in Bambali almost no one accepted. There, the future was not something to choose, but something already set from very early on. Children would grow up doing familiar jobs, would stay, would continue life like their parents, and any thought that deviated from that path was seen as unrealistic, as dreaming, as straying from reality. When Mané began to show his desire to pursue football seriously, what he received was not support, but worried looks, advice mixed with doubt, and even outright refusals. His family did not want him to follow a path they could not see the outcome of, not because they did not believe in him, but because they did not believe in a world they had never touched. For them, football was not a profession, let alone an escape, but just a game. And a game could not feed a person. In the rare conversations about the future, his dream was never considered a serious option. It was always placed outside every plan, as if it did not belong to the life he had to live. And that gradually created a distance, not loud, not with big conflicts, but deep enough to make him feel like he was standing alone in his own family, not because he was completely rejected, but because no one truly understood what he was trying to hold on to. To continue pursuing football, Mané had no choice but to stay silent. He could not say everything he thought, could not share the hopes growing in his heart, and could not explain why he believed his life could be different. Instead, he learned to live in two different ways. During the day, he was the child everyone expected, listening, following, not deviating from what was accepted, and when no one was paying attention, he returned to the ball, to the dream he could not give up, a dream he had to hide like a secret, not because it was wrong, but because it was not allowed to exist openly. It was in this period that two people began to form clearly inside him. One silent person who followed the rules of family and community, and another person who was stronger, more determined, quietly nurturing a path that no one else could see. And having to maintain both of those people at the same time was not easy, because every passing day was a fragile balance between not disappointing anyone and not losing himself. There were moments when he wondered if he was on the wrong path, when everyone around him thought differently, when there was no clear sign that he would succeed, only a very small belief that even he sometimes was not sure about, and that doubt did not stop him, but made every step heavier, because he was not only fighting the circumstances, but also fighting the questions in his own head. The feeling of isolation did not come from being abandoned, but from not being understood. He was still among people, still living in the same house, but carrying a separate world that no one entered. A world that became clearer every time he touched the ball, every time he ran, every time he imagined another place, but also more distant, because the gap between dream and reality had never been so great. And it was in that struggle that Mané gradually became a different person. Not through obvious changes, but through the way he learned to keep everything inside, learned not to need immediate recognition, learned to believe in something no one else believed, and learned to walk alone without needing anyone to confirm he was going in the right direction. A quiet maturity that no one witnessed, but determined his entire path ahead. Because from that moment, his life was no longer one single path, but two parallel paths existing in the same person, and he was forced to walk both, even knowing that no one would truly understand it. There is a time in life when all hesitation no longer matters, when staying means giving up on oneself, and leaving means stepping into a dark area where no one can guarantee anything. For Sadio Mané, that moment came in absolute silence, with no official farewell, no full consensus from the family, only a decision kept in his heart long enough to become irreversible. He knew that if he waited any longer, if he kept seeking acceptance from those around him, he would never leave Bambali, and the dream he had hidden for so many years would gradually disappear over time, as if it had never existed. Leaving his homeland was not an act of courage in the way people often praise, but a choice full of fear, because he carried nothing but a very fragile belief that there was somewhere out there that would give him a chance. No money, no clear plan, no one to go with to share the burden. Every step was like a bet, and if he lost, he would not only lose the opportunity, but also lose the place to return to, because when a person leaves amid everyone's doubt, returning is no longer simply coming back, but accepting that he was wrong. The journey to Dakar was not a trip with a clear destination, but a series of long, uncertain days where everything was unfamiliar. From people and the pace of life to the way opportunities worked, he was no longer in the familiar space of Bambali, where even in poverty there was still a sense of belonging, but stepping into a world where he was just one of many trying to find a place to stand. No one knew who he was, no one cared where he came from, and no one had any reason to believe he would do something different. The first days passed with a feeling of being lost, when everything he once knew was no longer enough to help him move forward. Football was still there, but it was no longer simply an escape, but a real challenge, where he had to prove himself without any protection, and in every training session, every time waiting for a small opportunity, the fear of failure was always present. Not the fear of losing one chance, but the fear that everything he had traded would become meaningless. There were nights he lay in the silence of an unfamiliar city, with no family beside him, no one to say everything would be okay, only thoughts repeating about whether he was on the wrong path, whether those who doubted him were right, and whether he had the ability to continue. Those questions had no immediate answers, but they were strong enough to slow down every step, making each day a silent struggle, where just standing up and continuing was already a small victory. The moment he left was not just a physical decision, but an invisible boundary between two lives. Behind was everything familiar but no longer enough. Ahead was a path no one had drawn, and the hardest thing was not the first step, but continuing to walk when nothing guaranteed it would lead to where he wanted, because the farther he went, the more he realized there was no clear sign that he was getting closer to his dream, only a vague feeling that if he stopped, everything would end immediately. In that uncertainty, belief became the only thing he could hold on to. Not a strong, unshakable belief, but something very small, very fragile, enough for him not to turn back, but not enough for him to feel at ease. And that fragility made everything more real, because he did not walk with certainty, but walked with all the doubts that still existed. Every day was a time he had to convince himself that he should continue, that there was some reason that made him start this journey, and that if he could endure a little longer, maybe everything would change. But in the weakest moments, when fatigue and loneliness piled up, the thought of going back also appeared, not as a failure, but as a release from the pressure, from the uncertain days, from having to prove something that no one asked for except himself. And it was in those moments that his initial decision became clearer than ever, because going back was not just returning to Bambali, but giving up everything he had tried to hold on to, accepting that that dream had never belonged to him. So he continued, not because he was not afraid, but because he feared stopping more, and every step, no matter how small, became part of a journey where he had no choice but to go all the way, a journey with no guarantee, no certainty, only one person and a fragile belief, but enough to keep him from collapsing amid things that most people will never see and never have to go through. The days after that did not bring any clear changes, no explosive moments, no doors suddenly opening, only a series of long days with deprivation and instability that Sadio Mané had to get used to, little by little. Dakar was not a place where dreams naturally came true, but a place where dreams were tested almost to the point of breaking before having a chance to form. He had no stable place to stay, no clear source of income. There were days when finding a full meal was already uncertain. And in that situation, football was no longer simple joy, but something he had to hold on to so he would not feel completely lost. The trial sessions took place in fierce competition, where dozens, even hundreds of young men carried the same hope, and most of them would leave without an answer. Mané stood among them, not standing out immediately, without better training conditions than others, without anyone behind him to introduce or protect. Only the ability and will he brought himself. But in an environment where everything was decided very quickly, sometimes that was still not enough. There were times he was rejected without explanation. Just a shake of the head, a glance, and the opportunity disappeared before he could understand what he had done wrong. Each time like that was not just a small failure, but a blow to his already fragile belief. Because when you do not have many chances, every chance becomes more important than usual, and losing it makes everything heavier, not because he was not strong enough to endure, but because he did not know how many more times he could continue before it all ended. With no family beside him, no one to tell him whether he should continue or stop, every decision had to be made by himself. Every consequence had to be borne by himself, and the loneliness in that situation was not being alone, but having no one who truly understood what he was going through, no one witnessing the efforts, no one seeing the failures, and no one there when he needed a word of confirmation that he was still on the right path. The long nights became heavier than any other time of the day, when all the noise of the city gradually died down, when there was nothing left to distract attention. Thoughts began to appear more clearly, repeating questions he could not answer, whether he was good enough, whether the decision to leave was a mistake, whether those who doubted him were right, and whether everything he was enduring would lead to anything. Those questions had no answers, but they were strong enough to make everything heavier, making each passing day not only a physical challenge, but also a mental challenge. There were moments he felt he was standing on a very fragile boundary, where just one more failure, one more rejection, everything could collapse completely. Not because he was weak, but because this path had never promised anything certain, And continuing sometimes did not rely on confidence, but only on the fact that he did not know what else to do besides continuing, because going back meant accepting that everything he had traded was meaningless. In the hardest days, when his body was tired from lack of food, when his spirit was worn down by rejections, what kept him going was not a clear vision of the future, but a very vague feeling that if he stopped, he would lose a part of himself that he had tried to preserve all this time, a part that could not come back if abandoned. And that feeling made him continue, step by step, day by day, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he could not accept not trying his full ability. Those efforts were not recognized immediately. No one stood up to applaud, no one said he was getting closer to the dream, but they accumulated over time, creating a change that was initially hard to notice. He began to understand himself better, the way he played, what he needed to improve, and even though the results had not come, he was no longer completely lost like before, because in that long silence, he had learned to exist without needing confirmation from the outside, learned to believe in what he was doing even when there was no evidence that it would lead to success. And in all of that, the most remarkable thing was not that he continued, but the way he continued, without noise, without showing off, without needing anyone to know, just simply not stopping. A quiet but persistent perseverance, which later would become the foundation for everything the world sees. But at that time, it was just a series of difficult days that no one recorded. No one remembered except himself. Then the time also came when those silent efforts began to be seen. Not with immediate applause, but with clearer opportunities, invitations from farther places. And for the first time in his life, Sadio Mané stepped into an environment where his talent was no longer overlooked. The journey to Europe opened like a door he had only dared to think about in silence. From the days at FC Metz to when he gradually established himself at Red Bull Salzburg, everything began to change in the way he had once hoped. Better living conditions, food no longer a problem, more stable housing, systematic training sessions, professionally organized matches, all creating a world completely different from what he had known before. A world that from the outside seemed as if all the hardships had been left behind. But right at the moment when many people thought he had finally reached what he wanted, a different feeling gradually appeared, silent but clear. The gap between what he achieved and what he felt inside grew larger. Success did not bring the relief he had once imagined. It did not erase the old memories, did not make the past distant, but on the contrary, it made them even clearer. Because every step forward made him realize how far he had gone, not just geographically, but as a person. In the clean rooms, in the unfamiliar cities with their fast and cold pace of life, he began to realize that he did not truly belong there. The language was different, the culture was different, the way people communicated and lived was different. Everything operated according to a logic he had to learn from scratch. And even though he could adapt on the field, outside of life the feeling of being lost still always existed, not because he was not capable of integrating, but because a part of him was still held back where he began, where everything was simpler even though it was harder, where he did not need to try to become someone else. Success brought tangible things, but it did not bring a sense of belonging. He was no longer the boy in Bambali, but he had never truly become part of the world he was living in. And that very gap created a very special silence. A silence that no one around him could notice, because from the outside, everything was still unfolding exactly as a success story should. The returns to memory became more frequent, not through actions, but through thoughts. Images of family, of the small village, of the days he ran on dusty ground with an old ball, all still there, not fading, not disappearing, as if time had only changed the circumstances but not what had formed him as a person and that made every success more complex, because it was not just a step forward but also a reminder of the growing distance between the two worlds he was carrying. There were times he wondered if this was really what he had been looking for, not because he did not know how to appreciate what he had, but because the feeling of completeness had never truly appeared. The goals, the victories, the praises, all had value, but they were not enough to fill the emptiness inside, an emptiness that did not come from the present, but from what he had been through before, the losses, the deprivations, the years when he had to overcome everything by himself, without anyone by his side. And it was in that incompleteness that something else began to form more clearly. A second life he had never spoken about, but that always existed, where every success did not belong to him alone, where every step forward carried responsibility for those left behind, where he could not allow himself to live as people expected from a star, because for him, having more did not mean keeping more, but sharing more, a thought not everyone understood, but that became an inseparable part of the way he existed. And from then on, the distance between the two lives was no longer just a feeling, but became a clear reality. One side the world he was living in, with everything he had achieved, and one side the world he had never left, with everything he still carried, and standing between those two worlds did not bring balance but a prolonged tension, where he had to constantly adjust himself so as not to lean too much toward either side, because if he did, he would lose a part of himself, a part he had lost so much to keep. Then came a time when everything accelerated so fast that even he could not realize how far he had gone. When Sadio Mané set foot at Liverpool FC, it was not just a step in his career, but the door that brought him into the center of a world he had only observed from the outside before. The stadiums were bigger, the pressure was greater, and the eyes of millions of people now focused on his every movement. It was no longer small stands, no longer matches with little attention, but Champions League nights, the highest level matches where every mistake was magnified and every success was elevated to a symbol. Under the guidance of Jurgen Klopp, he became an indispensable part of the lineup. His speed, endurance, and goal-scoring ability quickly established his position. Consecutive goals, explosive runs that left opposing defenses helpless, and step-by-step the name Sadio Mané was no longer unfamiliar to anyone following football. It appeared in newspapers, in discussions, in rankings of the best players, a recognition he had pursued for many years. But when it came, it did not bring the simple feeling he had once thought. The titles began to appear, not by chance, but as an inevitable consequence of what he and the team had built. The UEFA Champions League title in 2019, where he and his teammates stood on top of Europe after long nights of fighting, then the Premier League in 2019-2020, the title Liverpool had waited for 3 decades, and in that journey he was not just part of the team, but one of the most important factors, someone whose absence made the lack obvious, and whose presence made everything flow more smoothly. Individual awards also came gradually: the Premier League Golden Boot, selections to the Team of the Season, recognition from international organizations, all creating an almost perfect image in the eyes of the public. A star who was not only talented but also professional, someone who from the outside seemed to have no weaknesses. The media began to tell his story in the way they were familiar with, a journey from poverty to glory, an example for those who were dreaming, a symbol of rising up. And in those stories, everything was neatly arranged with a beginning, a climax, and a clear result. But what did not appear in those stories was what could not be seen: the silences, the thoughts, the emotions no one asked about. The attention he received came not only from fans, but from all sides. The press, social media, analysts, all had an image of him, and each person held on to a part of that image as if they had understood him completely. But that very thing made the gap between the real person and the public image grow larger. Because when a person is perceived too much in a certain way, the other parts of them gradually become obscured. Not because they disappear, but because no one looks at them anymore. His days no longer revolved only around playing football, but also around maintaining an image. not as something fake, but as an adaptation to the way the world saw him. Interviews, public appearances, all took place within a framework he had to learn to step into. And in that process, his private space gradually shrank. Not suddenly, but little by little, when every action could be observed, every word could be analyzed, and every moment could become part of the story others were telling about him. There were times he stood in the middle of the crowd, being called by name, being welcomed, but felt distant from what was happening. Not because he did not appreciate that love, but because he knew that what they were seeing was only a part that was illuminated and shaped, while the rest still lay in the shadows, not because he wanted to hide it, but because no one was really searching for it. The feeling of being perceived through an image rather than the real person was not something easy to describe. It did not come as a shock, but as a slow change, where he gradually realized that what people said about him was not completely wrong, but also not completely right. And between those two things was a gap that only he could feel. Success continued to come. Titles continued to be added, and from the outside the story seemed complete. A journey from poverty to the peak. An ending many dreamed of, but for him it was not the end, but just another stage, where the pressure was no longer about proving whether he could do it or not, but about maintaining what had been achieved, and at the same time not losing what had formed him from the beginning. And in all of that, the hardest thing was not playing, not facing opponents, but keeping the balance between two lives that were increasingly separating. One life that the whole world saw and honored, and another life that he still carried in silence, unchanged, not disappearing, only waiting for the rare moments when he could return to it. Even if only in thought, while all eyes were still following his runs on the field, while the titles continued to be mentioned as proof of a life that had reached the peak, in a place very far from those stands, a different flow had begun long ago that almost no one knew about. Sadio Mané never saw his success as something that belonged only to him, because from the very first days he had a stable income. The first thing he thought of was not the things many others would choose, but the people who had stayed behind, the people who had never left the life he had once experienced and had never had the chance to change it. The first amounts of money he sent back came without any explanation, without announcement, without any desire for recognition, just simply an action that for him did not need to be spoken to have meaning. His family began to have better living conditions. Basic needs were no longer constant worries. But that was only the beginning, because when he looked further, he saw that what he could do did not stop at the scope of one family, but could spread to an entire community. From the initial support, he gradually did bigger things, building schools so the children would not have to grow up lacking opportunities like he had, building medical facilities so that diseases would no longer be unavoidable sentences like the way he had witnessed with his father, providing basic conditions that many people there had never had. But all of that happened in almost complete silence, with no speeches, no media campaigns, no arranged images to spread, only real changes, slow but clear, in the lives of the people he had never forgotten. While the world saw a star enjoying the fruits of his success, in another corner he was living a life that none of them could imagine. A life without lights, without attention, only responsibility and choice. The choice to keep everything at a personal level, not turning his actions into part of the public image, because for him, if something needed to be spoken to have value, then perhaps it had already lost its original meaning. The separation between the two lives became clearer, not through specific boundaries, but through the way he acted in each world. On the field, he was part of a large system where everything was observed and evaluated, where every action could become a story. But off the field he kept for himself a space where those rules no longer applied. A space where he could decide without explanation, where what he did was not measured by the attention it received. There were people who knew about the things he did, but most of them were not voices in the media, but the people who directly received the help, People whose lives changed in ways that did not need to be told to have meaning, and that very thing made what he did continue to exist outside the public eye, not because he tried to hide it, but because he did not seek to bring it to light. Over the years, those actions did not stop, did not interrupt, did not depend on form or results on the field. They became a fixed part of his life, a part unrelated to how many goals he scored or how many titles his team won, a part that, if separated from football, still existed with its full meaning. While his career continued to develop, those responsibilities also grew over time. Not because he was forced to do more, but because he realized he could do more. And each time like that, the distance between the two lives was stretched a little further, not because they contradicted each other, but because they operated according to completely different rules. One side the world of recognition, one side the world of silence. And he stood in the middle, keeping both from blending into each other. It may be difficult for many people to understand not sharing such things, because in a world where everything is recorded and spread, keeping it to oneself seems to go against the way things work. But for him, it was not refusal, but a choice, the choice to keep his actions from being changed by how others perceived them, the choice not to let attention distort the original purpose. And it was in that choice that something else became clearer, that the second life he had lived for many years was not a temporary part, but an inseparable part, a part he did not need to speak about for it to exist, and did not need anyone to confirm to know it had meaning. Because, for him, the value of what he did not lie in how many people knew about it, but in how many lives it had changed, even if those lives never appeared in the stories the world was still telling about him. What began as a personal choice gradually became a responsibility he could not put down. Because when a person changes the lives of those around him, expectations no longer stop at gratitude but quietly grow over time. And with Sadio Mané that happened naturally but not at all gently. His family no longer had to worry about basics as before, but that very change brought a more and more obvious dependence. Not in a negative sense, but in the way all eyes gradually turned to him as a support. A person who could solve problems that no one had been able to solve before. And from a small family, that circle expanded to an entire village where every improvement in life bore his mark. Where his name was not only attached to football but also to hope. Those expectations were not spoken directly. No one stood in front of him and demanded, but they existed in the way people looked at him, in the stories told, in the belief that he would always be there, would always continue, would always be able to do one more thing, and that very silence made the burden harder to identify. Because when there were no clear limits, responsibility also had no clear stopping point. He did not know what was enough, did not know when he could pause without disappointing someone. While his career continued to advance, every title, every contract, every step forward carried a meaning beyond the personal. It was not just his own success, but a signal sent back to where he came from that this path was still right, that the faith placed in him was not meaningless, and therefore the pressure to continue succeeding was no longer a simple motivation, but became an obligation, something he did not allow himself to fail at, not because he feared losing fame, but because he feared hurting those who had placed hope in him. There were days when his body was tired, matches were dense, small injuries accumulated, but stopping was not an easy choice, because in his mind, resting not only affected himself, but could affect everything that depended on him. And that very thought made him continue even when he was not at his best. Not because he did not know his limits, but because he felt he did not have the right to set that limit. The fatigue came not only from the physical, but from having to maintain a stable state for a long time, where any decline could lead to consequences he did not want to face. And while fans only saw what happened on the field, they did not see what happened inside. The thoughts that were never spoken, the pressures that could not be shared, because in his position showing weakness was not easy, not because it did not exist, but because he did not know where to put it. There were moments when he was alone, not because he wanted to separate from everyone, but because that was the only time he could face himself without having to maintain any image. And in those moments, everything became clearer. That the life he was living was not only the result of what he had chosen, but also the result of what he had received. And balancing between those two things was never easy, because every time he thought about reducing the burden, another feeling appeared, the feeling that he was moving away from what had formed him, that if he began to put himself first, he might lose an important part of himself. The loneliness in this situation was not like what he had experienced before. It was no longer about having no one beside him, but about having no one who could truly understand everything he was carrying. Because those around him, no matter how close, only saw a part of the life he allowed them to see, while the rest, the part tied to responsibility, to pressure, to decisions with no absolutely right answer, still remained inside, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he did not know where to start if he wanted to share. And because there was no place to put it down, that burden continued to be carried, day after day, year after year, not decreasing, but only changing shape, sometimes as the pressure to perform well, sometimes as responsibility to family, sometimes as the expectations of an entire community, all piling on top of each other to form something that from the outside was very hard to recognize, but from the inside was clearly present in every decision, every thought, every step. In all of that, what was remarkable was not how much he could endure, but the way he chose to continue, without noise, without seeking sympathy, without turning what he was carrying into a story for others to understand, but keeping it as part of life, a part he accepted as a consequence of the path he had chosen, and that very acceptance, even though it did not make the burden lighter, allowed him to keep walking without needing to explain, a step that was not completely light but solid enough not to stop. There are people who, when they reach the peak, will find ways to enjoy everything they have never had. But with Sadio Mané, everything happened in a different direction, not because he could not, but because he did not allow himself to do so. When life had changed to the point where he could own almost anything he wanted, he chose to keep simple habits as if he had never left the place that had raised him, not as an image built for others to admire, but as a way of living that had sunk deep into the way he saw the value of everything around him. While many players of his time used success as a way to affirm their position through what they owned, expensive cars, luxurious houses, trips displayed as part of the new life, Mané went in an almost opposite direction. Not because he did not understand the value of those things, but because for him they did not bring a necessary feeling, were not something that made his life feel more complete. The rare images of him off the field usually carried no ostentation, no sign of someone trying to prove anything, just an ordinary person in the way he dressed, in the way he moved, in the way he existed. And that very ordinariness became different in an environment where standing out was often measured by the level of luxury. What made his way of living special was not that he refused what he could have, but the reason behind that refusal. Because every time he faced the choice between keeping it for himself or sharing it with others, his first thought was not what he needed, but whether someone else needed it more. And in most cases, the answer always leaned toward the others. The memories of Bambali never left him, not like a pain that needed to be forgotten, but as a part that defined the way he saw the world. Every time he thought about spending on himself, images of the days of deprivation appeared, not to stop him but to remind him that what he had was not something everyone had the chance to reach, and that very awareness made enjoying more complex, not because he did not want to, but because he could not do it with complete ease. Some people looked at his life and thought it was humility. But in reality, it was not that simple. It was restraint, formed over time, a habit he did not need to try to maintain because it had become a natural part of the way he existed. He did not need to remind himself to live simply because he had never left that way of living from the beginning. In the moments when others might stop to enjoy what they had achieved, Mane continued to think about the things not yet done, about the people not yet helped, about the responsibilities not yet completed. And that made resting no longer an easy state, not because he did not have time, but because he did not allow himself to put himself outside what he felt he needed to do. This restraint was not always light, because it came with constantly setting limits for himself. Not limits on ability, but limits on the way he allowed himself to live. He did not prevent himself from having more, but he always asked himself how much he needed to keep. And the answer often did not lie in keeping, but in continuing to give. In a world where success is often measured by what a person accumulates, the way he lived created a clear contrast, not because he wanted to be different, but because he could not do otherwise. Because if he began to live the way many expected from a star, he would have to give up a part of himself, the part that had been formed from the difficult years, the part that had kept him standing when there was no guarantee, and losing that part was for him more frightening than any material deprivation. That is why, even though he had gone very far, even though he had achieved what many only dared to dream of, Mané still kept a certain distance from what was considered the reward of success, not because he did not deserve it, but because he did not see them as the goal, and in that choice there was a very special loneliness, because not everyone around him understood the reason, not everyone saw what had formed the way he lived, and not everyone could feel that behind that simplicity was not deprivation, but a conscious decision. A decision he continued to hold even when no one asked, and even when no one truly understood. The following years were no longer just the story of an individual trying to maintain the balance between two lives, but gradually expanded into a much larger responsibility, when Sadio Mané no longer represented only himself or a club, but became a symbol of an entire nation. In the Senegal national team jersey, every time he stepped onto the field, it was no longer simply a match, but a moment when millions of people placed their faith in him, not through direct words, but through the way they followed, hoped, and waited for something bigger than an ordinary victory. Senegal is a country where football is not just a sport, but pride, a place where dreams are entrusted to players representing the nation. And in that context, Mané's role became more special than at any time in his career. He was not just one of the best players, but someone whose presence made the whole team different, a spiritual support that no one could replace. Major tournaments, especially the Africa Cup of Nations, were no longer simple playgrounds, but places where all eyes focused, where every touch, every decision carried meaning beyond the limits of sport, when a shock could become the joy of an entire country and a mistake could become a long regret in the memory of millions. In those moments, the pressure did not come from opponents, but from expectation itself, from knowing that he was not playing just for himself, but for people he might never have met yet, who had a deep faith in him. The Africa Cup of Nations 2021 final was one of the moments when all of that converged. When Senegal reached the final match, it was not only with the goal of winning the title, but with the desire to rewrite history. And in that match, Mané was not just a player but the center of all expectations, all eyes, all hopes. Every run he made carried a weight that not everyone could feel from the outside. When he stood at the penalty spot, the space seemed to quiet down, not because the sound disappeared, but because everything focused on one single moment, one single decision. And in that second, all he had been through, from Bambali to the biggest stadiums in the world, seemed to converge. Not to create pressure, but to remind him how far he had gone to be there. When the ball went into the net, it was not just a goal, but a release. Not just for him, but for an entire nation that had waited for this moment for many years. And in that moment, joy spread without limits. But even in that joy, there was something not everyone noticed. The relief of a person who had just completed a great responsibility, a burden temporarily set down, even if only for a short time. But moments like that did not make the pressure disappear, but only temporarily changed its shape. Because after every success, expectations rose again. No one doubted his ability anymore, But that also meant he no longer had space for mistakes. Each next tournament, each next match carried an unspoken question of whether he could repeat it, whether he could continue to be the one bringing hope. The mental tension did not only appear in big matches, but stretched through every preparation phase, every training session, every small decision, because he knew that any decline could affect more than what people saw. And while those around him could share the joy of victory, these pressures were often kept inside, not because he wanted to hide them, but because he did not want to turn them into a burden for others. There were times he stood among teammates, among people sharing the same goal, but still felt that a part of the responsibility he carried was his alone, not because he wanted to take more, but because his position made it unavoidable. And in that silence, he continued to walk, not with lightness, but with a determination that had become instinct. An instinct formed from the years when he had learned to endure without anyone witnessing, and now, in a larger context, that instinct continued to keep him standing firm even when what he was carrying was no longer just his own. There are moments when, even after getting used to carrying pressure in silence, the body still reaches a limit that willpower cannot overcome. And with Sadio Mané, that moment came not in a clear failure, but in a sudden stop when the injury happened at the time when he needed to be strongest, right on the eve of the World Cup, the tournament that not only he, but an entire country had been waiting for. All the preparation, all the expectations, all the hopes seemed to converge at one point, and then everything was blocked by something he could not control. When the news of the injury spread, the first reaction was not anger but a very deep silence, a feeling hard to describe when knowing that he could not do what he had prepared for many years, not because of lack of effort, but because the body no longer allowed it. And in that moment, all he had built seemed to be placed in a void where effort no longer meant results. The feeling of helplessness did not come from not being able to play, but from not being able to be there when the national team needed him most, not being able to share the moments he had once carried, not being able to stand on the field to carry the hope of those who had believed in him. And that created a very different pain, not loud, not explosive, but lasting, because he could not change it, could not fix it, could only accept and watch from a distance he had never been used to. The days of the World Cup became a series of moments where he had to learn to face himself in a different way, no longer the one directly participating, but the one watching, a position he had never prepared for. Each match was no longer a place where he could make an impact, but a place where he had to accept what happened without being able to intervene. And in every situation, every missed opportunity, every moment when he knew he could make a difference, that feeling became clearer. The disappointment did not only come from the results, but from not being part of the journey. When his teammates fought on the field, he was outside, not because he chose it, but because he no longer had a choice. And in that separation, a question began to appear. Not big, not clear from the beginning, but enough to make him think about the value of himself when he was no longer playing, when he could no longer contribute in the way he was used to, when his role was limited by things he could not control. For a person who had tied himself to the ability to contribute, being separated from that was not just an interruption, but a change in the way he saw himself, not because he forgot what he had done, but because the present no longer reflected it. And in that period he had to face a version of himself he had never been used to, a version that could not run, could not score, could not directly create influence. Those thoughts did not make him lose his determination, but made everything heavier, because he was not only recovering physically, but also had to adjust the way he existed in a situation he did not control, and that required a patience not everyone could maintain. When the tournament ended, there was no clear moment marking the end of the sadness, because for him it was not just a tournament missed, but a part of the journey he could not participate in, a part he knew he could have done differently, and that very thought lingered after everything had passed, not like simple regret, but like a silence he had to carry. In the days after that, When everything gradually returned to normal from the outside view, inside him there was still a gap, not big enough to make him stop, but enough to remind him that willpower could not always lead everything, that there were limits he had to accept, and accepting that was not a sign of weakness, but a part of the journey he could not avoid. And it was in that period that something else became clearer, that his value did not only lie in what he did on the field, but also in the way he faced the moments when he could do nothing, the way he kept himself steady when he was no longer in the familiar position, and the way he continued to walk, even though a part of him still remained with what could not happen. After the long silences because of the injury and the thoughts he was forced to face alone, there was a part in Sadio Mané's life that always existed like a shelter, not to escape the world, but to keep what he did not want to lose. That was family, relationships not affected by lights or fame, moments when he could return without needing to be a star, without needing to meet any expectations other than simply being an ordinary person. His marriage did not appear in the newspapers the way many expected, with no detailed stories told, no widely shared images, no official confirmations repeated many times. All of it was kept at a distance that only those truly close could reach, not because he wanted to create mystery, but because he clearly understood the price of letting the world step too deep into his personal life, especially when fame could turn anything into an exaggerated story. Family for him was not part of the public image, but the only place where he could put down everything he carried, where he did not need to explain, did not need to maintain any image, where what he had been through did not need to be retold to be understood. Because the people there had known him before it all began, and still saw him that way, unchanged. That is why he chose to keep his private life completely separate from what happened on the field. Not through rigid rules, but through the way he decided what should be shared and what should be kept. The media could know about what he did in his career, could analyze every match and every form, but when it came to his personal life, he stayed silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because he did not want to turn those things into part of the public story. The boundary between work and private life was maintained clearly by him, not by completely avoiding, but by controlling what crossed that boundary. He appeared when needed, he shared when needed, but he always kept a part that no one outside his close ones could access. And that very control helped him maintain balance in a world where boundaries are often blurred. Protecting his loved ones was not just a choice, but became a responsibility he set for himself, because he understood that fame not only brought opportunities, but also pressure, attention, and sometimes things no one was really prepared to face. And he did not want the most important people in his life to bear those things just because he had become someone the public knew. There were things he could accept for himself but did not want to impose on others, and that very thought made him keep the distance, not to separate, but to protect. In the moments when he was no longer under the lights, when matches ended and the noise died down, his life returned to simple things, conversations not related to football, meals not interrupted by attention, periods when he could be himself without thinking about how he was being seen, and those very moments became what kept him balanced. What helped him continue walking without being completely swept into the outside world. The silence in his personal life was not emptiness, but a conscious choice, a way to keep what was most important in a life where most of it already belonged to the public, and in that choice there was a clarity that not everything needed to be shared to have value. Not everything needed to be seen to exist. And there were parts of life that the fewer people knew, the more they kept their original meaning intact. Then time brought him to another chapter of his career where the pace could change, the environment could be different. But what he carried remained intact. When Sadio Mané put on the jersey of Al Nassr FC, it was not just a step in his football career, but a shift to a new space where everything was no longer like what he had experienced in Europe, no longer the familiar stadiums, no longer the old rhythms, but the pressure still existed in a different way, lighter in some aspects, but never disappearing. Because no matter where he was, his name still carried expectations, and was still tied to what he had once achieved. In the new environment, he continued to play and contribute. But at the same time, he entered a stage where the perception of himself gradually changed. No longer a player climbing to the peak, but a person who had gone through most of the journey, carrying experience, carrying memories, and carrying the things he had never put down. While life on the field changed over time, the rest of his life almost did not change. The support for his homeland continued without interruption, independent of where he was playing, because for him it was not a side part of life but a core part, a part inseparable from the person he had become. The schools, the medical facilities, the people in Bambali still existed in his thoughts every day, not like distant memories, but like a present part he always turned toward. And even though the geographical distance changed, the distance in his mind had never really been pulled far. The two lives continued to exist in parallel, not blending, not replacing each other. One side the field, the matches, the responsibility to the new team, new teammates, new goals, and one side, the things he had maintained for many years, responsibilities without deadlines, connections that could not be cut, and keeping both existing together was not a perfect balance, but a continuous process of adjustment where he always had to be aware of where he was standing, what he was doing, and what could not be allowed to change. There were times he looked back at the path he had taken, not with regret, but with a clearer understanding of what he had been through. From Bambali to Dakar, from the days with nothing to the days when he could change the lives of others, everything did not happen in a straight line. There was no clear plan from the beginning, but a series of choices, risks, times when he had to keep going without knowing what was ahead. And those very things had created the person he was now. But when looking forward, the question was no longer what more he could achieve, but how he would continue, when what he had achieved had surpassed many limits he once knew, when the responsibilities he carried showed no sign of decreasing, and when time no longer stood on his side like before. Each step became more meaningful, not because it was bigger, but because it had to be chosen more carefully. The feeling of not completely belonging to any world was not a loss, but a state he had learned to accept. He was no longer the boy in Bambali, but Bambali had never left him. He was not completely part of the modern football world, but he had left his mark in it. And between those two things, he existed like an intersection point, not trying to choose one side, but keeping both as inseparable parts. In the silence of those thoughts, there was no hurry, no need to prove anything more. Only a person continuing to walk, carrying everything that had passed, and preparing for what remained. Not with absolute certainty, but with the understanding that this journey had never been about reaching somewhere, but about how he had gone through each segment of the road, and how he would continue, even though the road ahead was no longer as long as before, but still long enough for him to hold firmly to what he believed. When looking back at the entire journey, from the early days in Bambali to the biggest stadiums in the world, Sadio Mané's life does not appear as a straight line of success, but like a series of overlapping paths where every step forward carried a part of the past. Nothing was really left behind, only carried in a different way, more silently, more heavily, but also shaping more clearly the person he had become. From a child growing up in deprivation where having enough to eat was already uncertain, where his father's death left a void that could not be filled, he stepped into a world where everything seemed completely opposite, where the lights never turned off, where success was measured by numbers, titles, moments witnessed by millions of people. And in that journey, he had achieved things not everyone had the chance to touch, from the Champions League to the Premier League, from individual titles to global recognition, all creating an image that from the outside could be called complete. But if stopping only at what he achieved, that story would not be different from many other stories, because what made his life different did not lie in the titles, but in the way he chose to live with them, the way he did not let them become the only center of his life, but placed them beside other things, things not mentioned much but occupying a larger part in the way he saw himself. What he had given away was not temporary actions, not decisions made in an emotional moment, but a process lasting through many years, a choice repeated in every stage of life, from supporting family to changing the life of an entire community, from the smallest things to things that could create long-term impact, all happening in almost complete silence, not because he wanted to keep it secret, but because he did not need to speak it to know it had meaning. In a world where success often comes with keeping, accumulating, building an increasingly larger image, the way he lived went in a different direction, where every step forward did not lead to keeping more but to giving more, and that very thing created a difference not everyone recognized right away, because it did not appear clearly in what could be seen, but lay in what he chose not to keep for himself. The sacrifice in his life was not great easily recognizable moments, but small choices repeated over time. Times when he could choose to rest, but continued. Times when he could keep, but shared. Times when he could put himself first, but chose the opposite. And that very repetition created a person who, when looked at from afar, might seem to have everything, but when looked at closer, one saw that he had left a lot behind, not because he lost it, but because he actively chose not to keep it. In all of that, there is a truth not always spoken, that giving does not make the burden disappear, but sometimes makes it clearer, because every time he helped someone, the responsibility did not stop there, but continued to expand, continued to create new expectations, new needs, and he again had to face the question of how far he could go, how much he could do without losing himself. A question with no fixed answer, only choices made in each specific situation. And even though he had gone through so much, even though he had achieved what many considered the peak, he still continued to walk, not because he still had something to prove, but because that journey had never been only about the destination. It had always been about how he continued, how he held firmly to what he believed, and how he lived with what he had chosen. His image in the present is no longer that of a person trying to rise, but of a person who has gone through most of the road, carrying both success and things that cannot be named. A person who is not perfect, not light, but still stands firm. Not because everything has become easy, but because he has learned to walk with what he carries. And if there is one thing that can be kept after all, then it is not the titles that will gradually become memories, but the way he has lived, the way he has chosen not only to be a player, but to be a human being. A human being who could have kept a lot, but chose to keep very little. And in that choice, there is a very simple truth that is not easy to carry out, that sometimes the value of a life does not lie in what a person has, but in what they are willing to leave for others, even if that means they have to carry more within themselves. The story of Sadio Mané is not simply a heroic epic about success, but a journey that makes people fall silent because of what he has quietly carried throughout his life. From the boy in Bambali, growing up in poverty, losing his father early, without a proper childhood, to the man standing in the lights of the field, but still living as if he had never left where he began. What makes this story heartbreaking does not lie in failure, but in the fact that even when reaching the peak, he still did not allow himself to live lightly like others. The detail that he sent money home in silence, built schools and hospitals without any publicity, or the fact that he refused a luxurious life to always remember the days of deprivation, all show a person who not only succeeded, but also carried a responsibility too great, and that very responsibility made him never truly able to rest. Even when the injury caused him to miss the World Cup, his pain was not only not being able to play, but the feeling of having let down an entire country. That is a pressure not everyone in modern society can understand. What makes viewers in the United States reflect is that in a culture that values individual success, Mané's story goes in the opposite direction. He did not accumulate for himself, but continuously gave, did not seek recognition, but chose silence. And that raises a very practical question. Does success really have meaning if it only stops at oneself? From his journey, the lesson is not to sacrifice everything like he did, but to understand that the value of a person does not lie in what they possess, but in the way they use what they have to create difference for others. In a society where the pressure for success is increasingly great, this story reminds us that keeping compassion, humility, and a sense of responsibility to the community is what truly makes a person worthy of respect, even if that means they have to silently endure more than what others see. If the story of Sadio Mané makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a word of gratitude for a person who has quietly given more than what he kept. Thank you for following until the end, and see you again in the next video, where we continue to explore lives where behind the spotlight there are always things not everyone sees.